Hello, this is Professor Imler, and I'm here to address some of the questions that came up in our discussion this unit. As you can imagine, a lot of the questions centered around what was going on in that Linderman reading on feminist ethics. So the first question that I've seen, or at least issue that I've seen come up quite a bit, is this question of, well, I thought gender was just sex, and you're either man or woman. Or at least that might not be how it was phrased, but that's something that's been kind of behind the question. And so what feminist theorists will say, and queer theorists, etc., will say is gender is fundamentally performative in nature. That means it's not directly tied to our essence, and so it's also and often imposed on people from the outside, and it's culturally conditioned, and it varies from culture to culture, but also within the same culture it varies throughout time. So in terms of the variance throughout time issue, one perfect uh, illustration of this is what kinds of clothes and accessories do we think we ought to get male babies? Often it's light blue, and some students tell me yellow. Um, when it comes to female babies, what do we get them? We get them pink. Whenever you pop back 100 years ago, and I'll dig up the source for when I do my final edits on this video, um, it was either reversed or at least blue was seen as a feminine color. Girls blue instead of pink like we do today. So that's just one example of a change. Um, an example of how gender is performative, primarily performative in nature, is, and I'll try to find a video and maybe intersplice it in this next section, is what kind of questions are asked of politicians who are female versus male politicians, or and uh, how are they discussed and critiqued in media, and that can be uh, like on late night talk shows, that can be on Fox News or MSNBC, some analysis shows, um, whatever it is. Women and men are asked different questions, held to different standards, and so the performance and how women display themselves is under a different kind of policing or scrutiny than males. And so as you ascribe femaleness or femininity onto uh, women's bodies and actions, we also ascribe uh, a certain set of expected behaviors and appearances, etc., onto male bodies. We expect them to behave in certain ways, and those can have consequences. So we might point to assertive women in workplaces are often called pushy or something like that. It's seen as a negative trait, and maybe I'll look up more of the terms later. Whereas men who are assertive in the workplace, that is seen as a good thing. He's a go-getter. He gets things done. But women who do the exact same things, sometimes even with but less aggressive prose in their communications, still get labeled in a negative way. So that's again how gender is performative in nature. And notice that has nothing to do with the physicality or the genes of males versus females. If we look at dictionary definitions, one thing you'll learn quite quickly in your academic career is that we don't want to use dictionary definitions at all. Dictionary definitions primarily capture uses of a word out in society. And so they might be poor uses of the word, or they might not reflect how we are trying to use this word in a particular type of academic discourse like we're doing here. So then there's the question of gender is about power. So as we think of gender as a set of behaviors or expectations that are ascribed or written onto people by others. You have this question of, well, how do people in significant positions of power, whether it's your boss, your parents, your religious leaders, etc., let alone like a police chief or the mayor of a city or a senator who is making policy on the state or national level, um, how do they see things? And so um, so a couple examples of this. John Piper, who is a major figure in the evangelical neo-reformed movement. Um, he is retired now, but he's widely influential in these circles. He posted an article recently saying, "Can women be seminary professors? Is that even allowed?" And if you get into that question, is there are certain readings of their sacred texts that say that women cannot teach men, and so then that you come to the question of, well, in what settings? So can women be Sunday school teachers? For these people, the answer is no, unless it's children, and then it can be a mixed group, and some people even divide there. These same people say that God gave husbands the role of master of the house, and women are supposed to be supportive. And that applies certainly for these people, these complementarians, um, in the home and in the church. And then the question is that they have, it's an internal discussion. Does that also apply in workplaces? So can a woman be a boss of a man? Some people say no, and so women need to be regulated to uh, support staff, if or just they need to stay in the home. But then there comes a question of, well, maybe not. Some people say, well, this isn't the church, this isn't the home. If the women are capable, they can do it. But then there's this question of what happens when work and church overlap. One of these places uh, is seminary. And so he came out with this article saying they should not. There should not be women professors in seminaries because they would be teaching men, and that would be a violation of the way he understands his sacred text. So that's one example of power, right? John Piper being an influential figure, having the ability to influence the lived lives of women, particularly those who are have an aptitude for teaching and want to teach in a religious setting. And so, as we think of gender as performative, what performances are allowed? Another thing that gets brought up here is this notion of what exactly feminism is in terms of its relation of women to men. So, in some popular discourse, and you might ask yourself if this is good faith or bad faith discourse, or if it began as bad faith discourse and then is adopted by people who have just heard it. So, like my parents have heard this from their media sources, and that's what they really think. So they're maybe having a good faith discourse, um, but the people that they got it from, maybe they didn't. Maybe they knew better where maybe my parents don't. Is feminism about if the hierarchy is male female, and historically it absolutely has, and I can give you really depressing lectures on that if you like. Oh gosh, they're so depressing. Fascinating in how the mental processes worked to justify it. But so is feminism about reversing the hierarchy, or because of all the problems, hating men and masculinity? Is it about equality? So is it leveling the playing field, or is it about something else? Um, so quite quickly, while there are some people who, through their readings of feminism and history, they get pissed off. If you read the history of oppression, anger is a natural response. Um, and then that can come out in hostility, whether it be in words, actions, etc. So maybe there's a bit of the male hating within people who identify as feminists, but fundamentally that's not the point, and that's not the goal, and that's not the behavior. But it makes for a really good counterpoint if you say, like, what's one way I can cut the knees out from people who say feminism is a worthy goal? Well, if I can convince others that it's primarily about hating men, well, there you go. That seems to be ridiculous. So feminism is ridiculous. And that's what's happening in a lot of, or I'm sorry, certain portions of our discourse. And that could either be good faith or bad faith. Um, Now, then we have the issue of, is it about equality? And in one sense, it absolutely is. In terms of like legal rights, do, like historically, women have had less rights. For instance, when did women get the right to vote in this country? There are questions that they certainly didn't have the same rights, and there are questions of, do we need to resolve certain disparities right now? So, in one sense, feminism, one of their goals is absolutely to get certain types of equality. But when it comes to the overall notion of becoming equal to men, like some of you noted in your discussions, well, which men, right? Um, in feminist discourse, we often talk about patriarchy, the idea that men are better than women, goes much further and defines that some men are better than other men, rich men, strong men, beautiful men, whatever. Certain races of men um, get certain advantages in society, and so which men are you talking about? The men that society has advantaged, or the men that society has disadvantaged? So there's that question of, well, there's lots of men with lots of different social statuses or statuses. Which one of those are we trying to be equal to? But then there's the more kind of fundamental question of, well, historically, and if you want this, let me know, and I can make a video or share resources with you. Um, Maleness was seen as the default humanity. And in some interpretations of religious texts, like men are created and that's human, and then a different thing pops up. And well, how is it different? How is it unique? It's not just the same as the penis thing, the man. Well, we have to describe it as not man, because man is our frame of reference. So this is female. So that's that male, not male, and female is assigned value and meaning as the not male thing. Um, so what this means is historically, and I can go into hours of examples, literally. If you're in some of my classes, I do go into those examples of men being the standard and women being a deviation from that standard and set within a hierarchy. And so, what feminism does not seek is to be restored uh, to an equal level of men, but still having men be the standard of value. Instead, and so when you hear people say, like smash the patriarchy, yeah, that might just be like an emotive, cathartic thing to say for certain people. But what that really kind of refers to is, um, patriarchy assigns men over women in certain, and so that is removing the hierarchy rather than having women move up in the hierarchy. That's the difference. That's the real issue on equality. With the last thing I want to talk about quickly, and we might look at this later on in class, is the issue of intersectionality. And so one of the best ways that I've seen this discussed is there's this article, and I might share it in the description of this video, called Explaining Privilege to a Poor White Male. So some people might say, my life sucks too. Um, I grew up poor. I had to borrow money in order to get this education, so I've had to borrow privilege. Um, Or like, I'm working my ass off and I can barely feed my family. Um, how dare you say that I have it better than this woman or that woman, particularly women who have made it, right? They're examples that there is no glass ceiling. Oprah, for example. What that leaves out is that there are different types of privilege and disadvantage, and that when we talk about the privilege of any individual or group, there's often an intersection of those different types of privileges. So um, that poor white man, he does have the privilege of being white. There are certain structures in society that lower the difficulty value of certain tasks just by virtue of race. Then he has the privilege of being male, and so he's not subjected to the same threats of violence. He's not subjected to certain pay decreases on the whole, right? Like in terms of average. So there are certain advantages to being male versus female. But then he's poor, right? And so class is certainly another major component of all this. So he's tremendously disadvantaged in terms of class. He doesn't have access um, to certain things, to lots of things. And that matters too. All of these axes matter tremendously. And you have to kind of determine overall where this particular person is. But what's one way to undercut critiques of class, critiques of gender, critiques of race? Well, it's to separate them out. So instead of seeing them intersectionally, you say, well, it's primarily about race. And so feminists shut up. Or it's primarily about gender. So uh, people who are talking about class and economics, you guys are doing it wrong, right? Um, so if we can separate those things out and pit certain people against other groups, well, then we can't organize, we can't band together, we can't work together to solve structural problems in society. So it's another way of, uh, if not control, um, pacification, certainly. And so we want to interrogate that and see where that shows up in society. So that's a little bit on the importance of intersectionality. I think that's most of the issues that have come up in terms of the gender discussion. So I think we'll leave it at that. Thanks for listening. I hope this was helpful, and I'll talk to you next time.